So my name is Cashin. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Avon Technologies PLC. We are a small to mid-sized UK-based manufacturer of protective equipment, mainly for law enforcement and military users. And we're headquartered here in the UK with another 4 facilities elsewhere, including 3 in the US. When I started in this role 3.5 years ago, Avon was in a difficult spot. It specialises in respirators, helmets, and at the time also body armour. And the business had been formed out of a couple of fairly large acquisitions in the preceding 2 years before I started. The acquisitions were not performing as anticipated and had led to a number of structural changes at the group, including commuting itself down to essentially a collection of functional leads, each in charge of every aspect of that function across all of the different product lines. Performance was very challenged, and it was immediately apparent as I came in that structure was not working, and I couldn't see a way to make it work. So the initial imperative was to understand what other operating models might be used to work, and then how we would go about implementing them. Obviously, I've known Davide and Giovanni at Strategy in Action for a number of years, having worked with them on a few previous mandates. And Davide and Giovanni are always good sounding boards. And so I started at the sounding board principle, but very quickly they became involved in turning a central functionally led organisation into 2 very discrete business units, each with all of the resources required to deliver what was going to be a relatively complex set of strategic actions to improve the financial and operational health of the business. As we move forward, so 2 years in, that transformation was largely complete. We had 2 fully functioning business units with leadership teams in place, and we then worked very hard to fully develop strategies for each of those 2 strategic business units. And of course, the challenge is not to articulate what the strategy is, but far more to turn it into actions that the business can go and deliver, so that we know and they know whether they are on track to achieve their goals. So as the 2 SBUs worked with Strategy in Action to develop their own individual strategies, some of the ideas that came out were something of a surprise to me. They weren't necessarily what I would have seen as being priorities for those businesses to do now. But the whole point of Strategy in Action is not really to come up with the perfect strategy. It's much more to come up with a strategy that can be deeply embedded and understood within the business. And it could be, by the way, that their ideas were better than mine. That's entirely possible. But they weren't what I had expected to see come out of that initial sort of skirmish. But what we did end up with was very detailed objectives and key results against each one of the strategic priorities, so that we could understand whether or not we were succeeding. I mean, the real benefit of the model that is used here is, number one, cracking a fairly complex organisation and driving a very detailed strategic overhaul. Of course, every subsequent year then becomes more of a refresh on what already exists, and so there was clearly a real crescendo of effort at the outset. Some of that effort has now sort of eased off a bit, but what we have got as a consequence is leadership teams in our SBUs who are very, very capable to take this strategy forward and to essentially do the refresh for the next year and the year after themselves. I'm delighted to say that we do keep engaging with 3 Horizons, because they will always be full of good ideas as to what particular aspects we could do better than we currently do. But this is clearly a learning methodology, and really what we've been trying to do is develop the muscle internally that we can develop and run our own strategic process. So the team here at Strategy in Action and 3 Horizons are extremely dedicated. There are a number of tools that are used around the design and execution of the strategy, some of which are quite complex, some of which are still under development, I think, to an extent. And therefore, it is hugely important that the team is always there and available for when we have questions. And I'm delighted to say that they have been, and I'm sure they will continue to be. They're extremely accessible. All you have to do is pick up the phone or drop a text message, and very quickly it gets responded to. That's really important when you're in the heat of the battle. In the week before you formalise strategy documentation or budget documentation, you really need help to understand exactly what's in, what's not in. For the stuff that is in, how is it in, how is it articulated, how do I know what those measures of success are? And so I'm grateful to the team for being as responsive as they are. I quite often get asked by peers, so people in equivalent positions at different companies, who we use for help on strategy. And quite often those people are using Bain or McKinsey to develop their strategic plans. I suspect that the output of a 3HORIZONS strategy won't quite be as shiny or as far-reaching as a Bain or a McKinsey strategy, but it will be 99.8% far more deliverable. And that's really what matters. The importance is not designing a glossy strategy brochure for the board for it then to go on a shelf for another year. What we really need to do is every day, every hour of every day, we need to be moving forwards in delivering each one of the objectives and key results that's set out in the strategy. And if we're not doing that, we're doing something wrong.